Hello, it's Tim Spector here of the ZOE COVID Study, giving you this week's update. Unless you live in Scotland, it's not very good news. The number of cases continues to rise, as does hospitalisations, whilst vaccine rates are flagging. And all this is in the context of a potential new Delta variant, which we're going to discuss. The only good news is if you've had a previous COVID infection and you've got some antibodies, which might give you a bit of extra protection for longer than we thought. So lots to discuss. So let's get in and look at this data in more detail. So we are seeing currently around 80,000 new cases a day, which is more than the confirmed cases and up quite a lot from last week. That means about 1 in 65 people are going around with symptomatic COVID, which is a hell of a lot. And about 22,500 of these people have already been double vaccinated and probably thought they were safe. And this is about a quarter of that total. And we're now seeing deaths averaging around 223 per day, which is the highest levels we've seen since March and really is just not acceptable anymore. And that's gone up. Long COVID, still very high, far too high, around 1,268 people we estimate getting it, and that's again increased. Hospitalisations are up at 915 a day. That's a leap of 27% from last week, and nearly 800 of them are on ventilators. So all this is not painting a good picture. And if we look at the graph, we can see that the increases are both in the unvaccinated and the vaccinated cases, are both going up at the moment. And our studies are in line with other surveys, so they're not random outliers with the ONS, etc. So let's look at the regional breakdown and see how your area is doing. We are not seeing declines in any area at all across the UK. I think that's clear. And it's actually on the rise in most places, particularly in England, where rates are really high, and we haven't seen rates like that since the spring. And even Wales, that was doing quite well, has started to see a slight reverse, and rates are too high there. Now Scotland, that's had most of the restrictions for longer, is about 40 or 50% lower than England on average, but its nice decline over the last few weeks seems to have petered out, and we need to keep an eye on that, and certainly no reason for any complacency. As you know, Scotland and Wales still have more restrictions than England, including mask wearing and needing to show some form of partial vaccine passports to go to events which are more crowded. And these are generally bad signs all over the country. It's hard for us to make any real comments on Northern Ireland. I do get asked this. At the moment, we don't have enough people reporting, so if you know anyone in Northern Ireland, get some more people reporting, we can give you some data. Now, let's discuss the related question of how we're doing on vaccines and boosters. And we've recently updated our vaccine map on the website to include rates in your area with people who've had at least 2 vaccine shots. To do log in, and there's a link in the description below if you want to find out what's going on, because there's quite a big difference across the UK, and we're seeing really the lowest rates across the country in many places in the cities and the Midlands. Obviously a big urban-rural difference. It's a place like Coventry, Leicester, Birmingham, and further north, Manchester, Bradford, Newcastle are problems. And of course, London is another problem area, particularly in the east and in more deprived areas. So big variety, and we are seeing higher rates in Wales and higher rates in Scotland. And if the vaccine passport continues there, I do expect to see those rates continue to climb in Wales and Scotland because of that increased carrot to get vaccinated, particularly for young people. Now, the other problem is that the vaccine program itself has really slowed down to a trickle. We're not going up fast enough. And we have a problem with the booster program that I was very optimistic about would sort out our problems, because we've been doing about 3.7 million people have so far had their booster in the NHS, including me. Very grateful for that. But there are about 8.5 million people who are now eligible for a booster who had their second dose back in March or April or before that. And so there's an increasing disparity. So every week there's a bigger backlog of people that are waiting for their boosters, and not enough are being given, as well as not enough of first and second vaccines. And I think this is primarily due to lack of staff in some of these centres. If you remember, a lot of them were volunteers who did a fantastic job, but probably got tired from doing this for nearly 9 months and want a break. So we may need to find a different way of delivering this. But every week that goes by, we're getting a bigger and bigger backlog, which is definitely a worry, because people who don't get the boosters are increasingly at risk of their vaccine waning, and tended to be either often the most at-risk individuals. So let's talk about this possible new strain. So some of my colleagues that I trust have identified a new Delta variant that's called AY4.2 at the moment. It hasn't yet been given an official Greek name. It's waiting for the WHO to give it its classification as a variant of concern. But in the UK, because we do much more genetic testing than any other countries, we're in a good position to find these. And the researchers have found that 10% of new cases now have this variant, which is quite similar to the original Delta variant, but they believe is 10 to 15% more transmissible than Delta, which, if you remember, was much more transmissible than the original Wuhan variant. So every time one takes over, it does get more easy to transmit. So the emergence of this has been suggested to be due to our high levels of infection, the fact that we're mixing partly immunized people who've been vaccinated with unvaccinated people, these 80,000 cases in the mix every day, huge number, that's 500,000 people in the population, some of them fermenting these new variants, much more than in other countries. And that's what US commentators are speculating. And that's one reason. Another reason we need to get these cases under control and not worry about problems abroad. We need to get our own act together in this country. Now, let's see again how we're doing internationally. And just to remind you, our population in the UK is only 66.5% double vaccinated, and it only went up about 0.5% in the last week. That's increasing at a snail's pace compared to many other countries, and we now have low rates compared to many of those comparable countries in Europe, as we can see from the chart. Portugal is doing very well at 86% of their population, and it'd be interesting to see what happens to their COVID figures. They're already pretty low, but will they completely collapse? Because that's the theoretical level of herd immunity. Now, Israel, which started so well and so full of optimism, they got the Pfizer jab in large numbers of people super fast, is having problems again, showing that countries that end up with this 60-odd% vaccination rate but no restrictions end up having problems getting the rest done. And other countries which have kept up minor restrictions but rolled out vaccination at a slower but steady pace seem to be doing much better. An interesting example is Ireland, which has come from way behind but is now almost 75% fully vaccinated, and they've still got restrictions in place, face coverings, big venues closed, no large events, and pubs closed. Now, I'm not saying I'd want all that, but it's just giving you a feel of what other countries are doing to keep these cases under control. So let's look at hospitalisations. We can see that US is still not doing very well, but rates are coming down there, whereas the UK is the worst in Western Europe by quite a long way, and our rates are going up. Israel is the other one that's still relatively high, with similar problems as ourselves. All the other countries which have higher rates of vaccination than us look as if they have got things under control and manageable levels of hospitalisations. And you can see Italy, Spain and Portugal have the lowest levels of all. And even Germany, which is starting to catch us up in vaccination, is doing much better than we are. Now, let's discuss antibodies. So we've been collecting antibody results from you, which you've been kindly logging for us in some collaborative work with the Department of Health, and linking that to positive PCR tests or positive symptoms in the past. And we know that if you've had antibodies from a previous infection, you get about a 65% protection from COVID-19, which increased to around 95% when you had, say, the full Pfizer vaccination. But when we looked at around 10,000 people who tested positive for COVID, we didn't show any great decline in their natural antibodies over that time. So this is good news for most people, showing that if you have developed antibodies, they're likely to stay with you for some considerable time. But and we don't really understand why they're not dropping off, which is what we would expect. The protection from infection seems to last for about a year. But crucially, not everyone develops these antibodies. And we think there's about 20% of you, that's 1 in 5 people, that don't seem to get their initial antibody response, which means that you're still susceptible to getting another infection. And unless you've got regular antibody tests, it's hard to know what your risk is. We're actually coming up with some data to try and work out who those at-risk people are. How do you know if you're in that 20% or not, which will give you better clues. So in the next couple of weeks, we'll be able to share that with you. But it does mean that just because you've been infected, if you don't know your antibody status, you don't know really whether you've got protection from subsequent infections or not. So it does mean that it is still absolutely valuable to get that vaccine, those 2 shots, to give you protection, because you don't know how well protected you will be after that infection. Unfortunately, we've stopped the invites for antibodies. A lot of you have asked us for this because our collaboration with the Department of Health on this has stopped as they've reached their capacity on this. They may be contacting you directly and so keep an eye out for that. If as antibodies, these are the natural antibodies after infection, are going to prove to be quite useful. Any antibody results you get after antibodies or infection, please do log it for us. It's really important. Thanks. So let's try and visualize your risks. I've given you a lot of information in the last few weeks, tricky percentages. So the ZOE team have kindly put this on a graphic for us to go through. And all this data was gathered from end of May to the end of August. So it was really talking about the current Delta variant. And I think people need to realize when they're thinking natural infection is much better than vaccine, therefore I don't need a vaccine, need to think about the data being current. Early data was a different variant, different times, and I think we need to look at the most recent data, which is showing a different picture. And if you look at the plot here, it makes it simpler to understand the various risks. On the left side, you've got cases where you've previously been infected, and on the right side, where you haven't, as far as you know, been infected, and we get a relative idea of your risks. Now, the lower you are on the chart, the greater your risk of getting COVID, and the higher you are, the smaller that risk. So we've seen from the ZOE data that you get about 65% protection up to 12 months after infection without a vaccination. So that's if you've been infected, your chance of getting reinfected is about 65%. So it obviously wears off over time, and that's sort of where a lot of people are now. And if you go up, you can see that that increases quite dramatically to 90% after 2 doses of the AstraZeneca and to 94% after 2 doses of the Pfizer. So that's if you've been previously infected, which is good news. Now, if you haven't been previously infected, we're seeing, and you get the vaccine at up to 6 months after AstraZeneca, 71%, which is still pretty good, but not quite as good as at the beginning. And with Pfizer, up to 6 months, you're getting 83% protection. So they do wear off, but they still are giving at least 4-fold protection against the virus. Hope that makes it clearer for you. And as always, we're going to talk about symptoms. 562 days, still waiting for HSUK to actually do something. Wonder what sort of crisis we need before the public are informed about the top symptoms. This week, not much change from last week. Slight change at the top. Headache, runny nose, sneezing, sore throat are the top 4 symptoms, and persistent cough is just ahead of loss of smell at number 5. And again, these are still the flu and cold-like symptoms you would expect. And you just got to remember that with around 1 in 65 of the population with it, it's still a highly likely scenario. So please, we do need the government to take notice as well. So to sum up, I think we're in no man's land here. We have a suboptimal vaccination rate. We really, in England at least, don't have any restrictions. Those that are not enforced, so it's getting more and more lax if you live in big cities on public transport. There's a general sense of complacency, and I think with high numbers of cases, long COVID, hospitalisations going up, we're in a bad place where not only are you going to get these new strains like this new one taking over, which could make it even harder to control it, but I think we've got to start seeing the vulnerable that are still waiting for their boosters being affected. So I think the government, in my opinion, needs to enact their rather weak plan B as a minimum, which enforces some of these measures and also particularly find ways to bolster our flagging vaccine plan, which is going to need more thought. We can't just rely on those volunteers that have been working so hard for 9 months. So I'm sorry I can't give you happier news, but that's the way I see it this week. Really, thank you for continuing to log daily. Your contributions are amazing, and all the people who gave blood for the antibody study were tremendous. Keep an eye on our website and our app for details. Remember to like and subscribe us, and stay safe and keep logging.